Okay, in this video we're going to take a look at the Battle of Lagarde that occurred on Monday and Tuesday, August 10th and 11th of 1914. Once again, this also occurred during the Battle of the Frontiers. And a quick note of clarification. At the time of the battle, the proper name for the town actually would have been Garden because it was in German Lorraine and not in French Lorraine. But for some reason, both the French and German sources refer to the town as Lagarde, which was the name prior to 1870 and then once again after the First World War. I think it's interesting as we look at the Battle of Lagarde here to kind of explore the whole idea of initiative. And by initiative, I mean both initiative on the battlefield and personal initiative. How did the two sides, the French and the Germans, view initiative? What were their doctrines regarding initiative? Also, how they executed initiative in the organization. And then finally, kind of what were the rewards for initiative at the end of the process, depending on how things turned out. So keeping that in mind, let's take a look at what happened in Lagarde on the 10th and in my next video, the 11th of August, 1914. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the elephant in the room here that is best summarized in the 1915 edition of the War Illustrated. As you can see here, the idea here is that the Germans, it is thought, have not learnt the lessons of the South African and Russo-Japanese wars. Their men are not encouraged to use their individuality in either attack or defense. This is a commonly repeated theme. Now let's see what the doctrine and documentation actually say. The Germans had a special word for their view of initiative. It was Auftragstaktik, which literally means mission tactics. Let's take a look at what that means. In the Prussian Kriegsministry exercise regulations for the infantry, number 126A, orders given from rearward commands will easily be made obsolete by the events. Timely action is often only possible upon independent decision. Subordinate commanders must recognize at the same time that they are required to solve the tactical problem as intended by the higher commander. And by the way, this emphasis is in the original. Moltke, in the 1910 version, stated, "Where subordinate leaders wait for orders, the opportunity of the circumstances will never be utilized." There are many situations in which the officer must act according to his own judgment. It would be absurd if he waited for orders in moments where often no orders could be given. As a rule, however, his work is the most profitable for the whole when he carries out the will of his superior. And finally, in the Field Service Regulations of the German Army in 1908, Section 26, it is no less important to educate the soldier to think and act for himself. His self-reliance and sense of honor will then induce him to do his duty, even when he is no longer under the eye of his commanding officer. Let's take a look at the French view of initiative. This is largely described in the French Decree on the Service of Armies in the Field, dated December 1913. There are other sources, but this seems to capture it fairly succinctly. Form of combat, offense, and defense. The two regulations affirm that only the offensive manages to break the will of the adversary, and that the defense never gives victory. Both recognize, however, that the defense must be necessary for some of the forces engaged in certain circumstances, but they are divided as to the definition of these circumstances, that is to say, as to the justification of the defense. The 1895 decree considers the defensive as a means of attracting the enemy to a ground where one believes to be able to fight under good conditions. From there to accepting that the value of a position can determine the command and prefer the defense to the attack is not far, and no conception is more dangerous. In order to avoid any misunderstanding on such an important point of doctrine, the new regulations admit only one justification for the defensive in combat, namely the need to save troops on certain points in order to devote more forces to attack. Understood in this way, the defense is no longer, strictly speaking, only the auxiliary of the offense, but the command must be able to report on the entire resistance capacity of the units which it has ordered to contain the enemy on the front. This is important. This resistance must be, like the attack, pushed to the end, that is to say, until complete sacrifice. The person executing orders unexpectedly placed in the presence of unforeseen circumstances is no longer bound to strictly comply with prescriptions which cease to be applicable to the new situation. He has the duty to take, on his own initiative, the necessary arrangements to achieve, despite all obstacles, the intention of the command. He reckons as soon as possible. The need to save troops in order to give more power to the attacks can lead to the defense in certain areas. But by itself, the defense can only contain the enemy for a limited time. It never brings success. Whatever the troops engaged, whatever the skill of their leaders' combinations, it is always necessary to march at all costs to the enemy and drive him out of his positions, or at certain points resist to the end and get killed on the spot. The officers and non-commissioned officers have the duty to work energetically to maintain discipline and to retain in their place, by all means, the soldiers under their orders. If need be, they force their obedience. Finally, they must be well imbued with the idea that their first and most beautiful mission is to set an example for their troops. Nowhere is a soldier more obedient and more devoted than in combat. He has his eyes fixed on his leaders. Their bravery and composure pass in his soul and can make all the energy and all the sacrifices. General Lescaut, informed in his turn, then plans to cross the border. It is very close and take the village of Lagarde. As he was entrusted with a mixed brigade, he has on hand, in addition to his cavalry, the infantry of the 15th Army Corps and certain elements of the 19th Reserve Artillery, which will provide the necessary artillery. Further to the east, our first elements had focused on the village of Lagarde, located in annexed territory on the Marne-Rhine Canal. The French offensive is announced. On the morning of the 10th, the order was given to constitute a detachment under the orders of Colonel Merlier, commander of the 59th Brigade, and Lieutenant Colonel Odon of the 40th Infantry Regiment, including a battalion of the 40th Infantry Regiment, 2 battalions of the 58th Infantry Regiment, and 1 artillery group to attack the village of Lagarde. The 2nd Battalion of the 40th Infantry Regiment was designated for this operation. At 11 a.m., the 2nd Battalion of the 40th Infantry Regiment moves from Etienneville to Perrois, where the staff of the 59th Brigade, commanded by Colonel Melier, is held. The Cornelier Battalion of the 58th left Moricourt for Juries. During the officers' meeting held at 3 p.m. at the Perrois Town Hall, Lieutenant Antoinette, whose pen name is Hélène de Penneron, a civilian journalist at L'Illustration and a renowned specialist in the Balkan War, announces that the assault will take place at 7:15 p.m. and transmits the corresponding orders to the officers concerned. Captain Kelliers, commander of the 1st Detachment of the Artillery, on August 10th at 4:30 in the afternoon, the 1st Detachment under the command of Captain Adelier, squadron leader, left his cantonment in Perros with 2 infantry battalions, 1 from the 40th and 1 from the 58th, for an operation against Lagarde. Batteries 1 and 3, Captain Sitze and Bondoa, take up position on Hill 276 west of Juries and fire at around 6 p.m. on Lagarde, the bell tower of which can be seen, and Hill 283 northwest of Lagarde, where there are trenches of enemy infantry. The 2nd Battery under Captain Calise passes south of the canal and follows the progress of the battalion of the 40th through the forest of Perrois. At 7:15 p.m., the capture of Tillot Wood allowed him to settle on the eastern edge of Perrois Forest, about 1,500 meters north of Juries. At night, they fired a few rounds at the village of Lagarde to help the infantry approaching the village. At 3 p.m., the infantry detachment in charge of the assault, under the orders of Lieutenant Colonel Odin, took up combat formation. The Bertrand Battalion of the 40th, which was to attack in the forest of Perrois, slipped parallel to the canal. The 58th rolls behind the Bas de la Croix. The Lagarde attack took place at 11 p.m. The village was taken with bayonets. Troops bivouacked in the streets and around the village. At 11 p.m., The village was in a state of defense, the 40th in charge of the east and south faces, the 58th of the north and west faces. The night is used to establish resistance nests and roadblocks on the road leading to the village. Ridge 283 was crossed around 8 p.m. after a very strong fire, and Lagarde was occupied around 9 p.m. The north and east edges were immediately organized defensively, and the battalion remained under arms all night, which passed without incident. The battalion commander is happy to point out the discipline and enthusiasm of the battalion in this affair, which for him is a baptism of fire. All of them, officers and troops, did their duty admirably. Lagarde was kidnapped with bayonets by 2 battalions of the 15th Corps with admirable courage, according to a news release on August 11th at 11:30. The activities of the Bavarian Cavalry Division between the 6th of August and the 10th had less of a drag on the teams than on the horses. The marches on the good but rock-hard roads made my legs tired and the fittings badly worn out. Above all, however, the movements and standing around with full war packs in the blazing, burning August sun had consumed my strength. The horses had been under the saddle for 13 to 14 hours a day. Only occasionally were they able to be watered during the day or given a few handfuls of oats in the feed bag. Some had failed to eat because of the lack of habituation or fatigue. A rest day would have been very desirable. It could not be granted yet. The advance of the French on Lagarde seemed to indicate that the French troops entrusted with the reconnaissance intended to change their previous purely defensive behavior. In any case, the German side did not want to allow the throwing back of their own border guard detachments to go unpunished. With energetic action, one could hope to obtain a little more clarity about the composition of the enemy facing, and perhaps on the basis of a rare detail known to the General Staff, to determine one or the other Army Corps that was deployed on this part of the front. Von Stetten initially intended a night raid on Lagarde, but then, at the suggestion of the commanding General von Bülow, arranged to meet the commander of the 42nd Infantry Division, and a violent reconnaissance against the named location. A major attack was envisioned.